Hello and good morning, everyone. It's Dexter from A2K, and thanks for joining us for today's webinar, What's New in Revit 2022 for Architecture. Technical lead Chad will be presenting for us today. So before we start, we'll just go through about A2K. We're all about fostering innovation through consulting and training. A2K Technologies plays a vital role in helping infrastructure, building, mining, construction, architecture, and manufacturing industries reach their full potential by delivering complete technology solutions and support services such as education and consulting. Working visionaries shape the future of design and in turn enable them through innovation to minimize risks, improve productivity and achieve excellence. A2K Technologies is considered business partner of choice and trusted advisor by vendors and clients. We partner with major software and hardware vendors to meet our clients' technology needs. We strive to exceed client expectations by pinpointing their challenges and delivering solutions through experience and innovation. We work with clients and companies that have been inside nationally and abroad. Over to you, Chad.
Okay, thanks, Dexter. Good morning and good afternoon to everybody, wherever you may be. I'm sure everybody is currently in lockdown like I am, but we're here to talk about Revit 2022 and the new features that were released a couple of months ago. As someone like myself who's been working with Revit for probably over 20 years now, I've been through obviously a lot of releases. And I think it's fair to say that the 2022 release in particular has been an exceptionally big release, if not probably one of the biggest that has ever been released since its first release. For the most part, we're going to go through a PowerPoint presentation covering a range of these features, and towards the end, I'll also just do a live demonstration of just a few of the features that I think are probably noteworthy. So without actually reading through what's been added or improved, we can see on this slide here that we've got a range of design productivity enhancements. Now, this list here does actually cover both architectural, structural, and services features. We are going to focus mostly on the architectural and platform features for this presentation. We do have our structural and services techs going to be doing those equivalent ones at a later stage. Now, on the design productivity stage, this does generally focus around the modeling aspect. And in addition to the design productivity features that were released, there were a handful of interoperability, a good deal of documentation, what they call efficiencies, I guess you could say, and a range of developer tools as well. I also won't be focusing on the developer tools because that is for a very small subset of Revit users anyway. So without further ado, let's just get straight into this. We've got about 40 slides of features to get through, and I do want to focus on some of them in a little bit of detail. So starting with the design productivity with the wall enhancements. So in past versions, we've historically had a more difficult time with getting walls to be anything other than just a vertical rectangular faced wall. If we needed to slope them or taper them in various ways, we generally had to have placed a mass object that had the slope on the surface and then use the wall by surface tool to apply it to the face of the mass. Now in 2022, we've got the ability to have at least some parametric controls over things like slopes and tapers. For the most part, we simply just select the wall, and we can see that there is a new instance-based parameter called cross-section that allows us to keep it either vertical, as tapered, or slanted. And depending on which of these options, these cross-section options we want to use, depends on obviously how it's going to then react based on the angles for either the interior or exterior side, or maybe both if we are talking about the tapered aspect of it. If you are familiar with the variable thickness floor objects that have been in Revit for quite some time now, where inside the type properties, we would turn on the variable part of a floor, the walls are actually much the same now, where we can have a variable part of the wall that we then use for the tapering and sloping. So a much welcomed improvement after years of using masses to generate these sloped and tapered objects. RPCs have received some enhancements in terms of their, I guess you could say, their quality and what we can actually place as RPCs. So they now do a better job of reacting to scene-based physics, I guess is a way we could say it. So things like the materials can get extra, I guess, shine and illumination depending on those environmental factors, making the RPC elements look and react a little bit better within the scene. There's a new billboard mode, which billboard generally refers to just keeping, I guess, what would be considered the front of the object always pointed towards the camera. So as the camera moves around, the object is essentially rotating with the camera. And we've also now seen the RPCs expanded out into the furniture category. So beyond that more common vehicle or entourage being people and plants, we can now use them with furniture categories. In the last couple of releases, we saw the addition and the improvement of the path tool or the routing tool. This has been improved again. So now we've got some additional rules that we can build into when we identify the best routing throughout the building. If you're not familiar with this existing routing tool, it's basically saying from point A to point B, what is the most optimal path between those 2 points. In this new release, we can now find multiple paths, again, based on some additional rules, and we can also put some blockers in the way by way of one-way directions and also simulating where people may be in order to be able to block routes and obviously find another more optimal path. I'm going to show you this towards the end of the presentation, as this is obviously a very relevant tool in our COVID environment at the moment, where we need to obviously maintain certain paths of direction or direction of those paths and to be able to move around people with that socially distancing that we have to do at the moment. There's been some family category improvements as well. So the base set of categories, which as we know, we can't modify and we can't add and remove and so forth. We've now got some additional categories added to the list. And you can see them on the left-hand image on the screen at the moment. This obviously adds a little bit of extra granularity into some other categories, things like the fire area where we had fire alarm devices. We can now have a fire protection one, but it also adds in some other fairly unique categories. Things like the hardscaping signage, I think is an important one that we should have had a while ago, but it's good that we've got it. Or even things like temporary structures where we might want to put things like scaffolding onto this particular category. And also, we've got some subcategories that are now exposed for scheduling as well. And that's the right-hand image over here where we can see for the floors, the roofs, stairs, and walls, that some of their subcategories are now available for scheduling purposes. Now, this one here is a fairly minor improvement. To be honest, it's one that hasn't really affected me in the past, but I'm sure it has affected others. And that is quite simply when we were in a schedule on the filtering tab and using the category as the filtering field, apparently the list of categories was a little bit of a mess. They were a little bit jumbled up and all over the place. And it made it actually hard to find the category so that you could select it and use it as a filtered item. So quite simply, this is a small improvement whereby the category or the categories under the category filter is now in an alphabetical sorted order. Okay, now while still sort of talking about that scheduling aspect of it, and also in the project parameters dialog box, we've now got some additional fields to help us to identify parameters. So to begin with, there is now a search field up the top here. Clearly, a list such as what's inside this screenshot here is quite short and easy to read, but we do know that certain categories, bigger projects and so forth can have more parameters. So therefore, the search field is going to give us a faster means to find the field so we can add it over into the right-hand side in this schedule. Furthermore, is also some filtering capabilities. So based on the parameters properties, we can then filter that list down, again, making it a bit easier to find the information that we're looking for. And both of those feature in the schedules and also the project parameters, as we can see. Just going one step further though, again, with trying to identify what types of fields we might want to be finding to add into our schedule, is the addition of a tooltip. When hovering over the top of these fields, you can see with this soffit finish that it's telling us that it's specifically a project parameter and it is a text type of property. Okay, now, in the last version, in version 2021, Autodesk introduced what they called their Load Autodesk Family feature. This is what they called a technology preview. So it was kind of released, but unofficially, I guess you could say. And we also know that many companies don't necessarily like to install the out-of-the-box content by default. Maybe they don't want that used, or maybe it's just an extra step that they don't want to do. And we do know that in past versions that we can have some troubles with getting the out-of-the-box content installed as well. Well, this Load Autodesk Family feature is now available to find out-of-the-box content, but from an Autodesk cloud location. Its dialog box looks a little bit different to what we would see with the typical Load Family dialog box. It's more like a little mini web browser whereby you can browse the categories. You can even use a filter up top here in the search to find the content that you're after. And when you've got it, we can load it directly from that cloud location. This is now a permanent feature inside of Revit as it moved out of its previous technology preview. So we've got a number of just really small enhancements on this slide here. In the past, when we use things like the modification tools, the options on the options bar were not remembered between Revit sessions. That is to say that you make some changes, you close Revit down and reopen it up again. And those previously made options weren't remembered. So now they do when working across different Revit sessions. I think you probably either fall into the category of this is great, or maybe you don't want this, but it's now happening. Likewise, in the material browser, it'll also remember the last tab that you are on. So that way, if you are doing a lot of work with materials that may be at an appearance level, you're doing a lot of visualization work, you need to get access to this quicker, well, it'll at least default to that last tab. And also another small improvement was the Revit Home loading page, which again, in past versions has been a little bit sluggish, I guess you could say. They've made some performance improvements to hopefully get you into either the project or the content a lot quicker than it has been. Again, another really, really small enhancement here is now the ability to resize many more dialog boxes. We know that certain dialog boxes, particularly things like the like text boxes, things like the purge unused, they usually start or open up quite small. Well, now we've got the resizing grip in the bottom right-hand corner for each of these kinds of dialog boxes, just making it a little bit easier to obviously view the contents of the dialog box itself. Okay, so moving over into the interoperability side of things, one that I'm quite excited about, I know many others would be, is the fact that we no longer have to print to PDF. All right, and when we had to do that in the past, we had to print to a virtual PDF driver. You could have used the built-in Windows one or some other third party. Well, now Revit has a dedicated export to 2D PDF feature. And just taking note here, this is actually found on the export option, not the print or the save as. Further to the addition of exporting to a 2D PDF is also now the capability to set up export naming rules. So if you are printing your sheets to multiple PDFs, that is one sheet per PDF file, and that file name needs to be named accordingly for that sheet, well, the new PDF naming rules will allow you to build up what you want your file names to be called. I'm going to show you this towards the end of the session as well, as I think this is quite an important and a feature that everybody, I think most people will welcome. Now, in addition to generating the PDF files as an export, it can also automatically detect the size and orientation. And we actually see that on the PDF export option. And the reason why we have this is obviously if we've got something like an A1 and A3 sheets within the same sheet set, then we need the ability for Revit to identify the difference in sizing so that it can be exported correctly. We do realize that there are plenty of architectural practices that use Rhino to do some interesting design and modeling. Getting that into Revit in the past hasn't exactly been the easiest thing in the world. So fortunately now, found underneath the link CAD is the ability to link in directly a Rhino 3DM file. It is treated much like a DWG file, I guess you could say, in that things like the layers are preserved when it is linked in, so that you can still use the visibility graphic overrides to be able to control the layers from that Rhino file. And as you would expect, being a vectorized format that we read as a model, I guess, we can also link to, or sorry, snap to the geometry that's found within that linked Rhino file. Now, on the Autodesk side, I think most people will probably be at least aware of Autodesk's Format Pro tool. It typically comes as part of the AEC collection, and it is Autodesk's equivalent of a sketching design tool. Now, in the past, there has been some limited interoperability between Revit and SketchUp back to Revit. In 2022, for both Revit and Format, there is now somewhat of a round trip process. That is, if we're inside of Revit and we want to undertake some really basic sketching, just as part of a what if scenario, what if we do a little bit of sketching over here to see what this might look like? Now, tools like Format can be a better tool to do that what if scenario than trying to deal with actual elements inside of Revit. So now in Revit 2022, on the Massing and Site tab on the Conceptual Mass panel, we can see that there is a Format 3D Sketch button. It'll take all the visible elements that are found within your 3D view. It'll open up Format and load that Revit, as what is essentially the Revit model, into Format. So you can then use the Format sketching tools to do some general sketching around those elements. Further to that, inside of Format, it then has a button to export the Format model back into Revit. So that way we go from Revit out to Format and then bring it back into Revit. So it gives us a nice, quick sketching environment now, while still maintaining the context of a more detailed Revit model. This did have a few little issues on release, which I understand may have been resolved now with an update. So just keeping that in mind if you are giving this a go. Speaking of formats still, with that round trip process where it comes from format and back into Revit, even though that previous workflow was a little bit more automated by pressing buttons on the equivalent user interfaces, we can also now take a format file and simply just link it into Revit as a CAD format. So in this case here, taking a format, AXM file format, we can bring that in, kind of like the Rhino example that we saw before as well. And just like those other examples, the layers from the format model also translate in so that we can use the visibility graphic overrides to control what we want to see from that format model specifically. So it's good to see that we've got some good extra interoperability features, even if it's non-Autodesk software like Rhino, but more so with their format tools as well. On the IFC side, this has just received the, I guess, upgrades to the IFC certifications. I don't work with IFC all too much myself, but I do know that others do. So this is just simply keeping the IFC format up to date with the newer certifications. And while we're also on the topic of interoperability, again, coming back to an Autodesk workflow, this time with Revit and Inventor. Now, Inventor on its own is making some inroads into being able to output an Inventor project, I guess their parts and assemblies, into Revit families so that we can use in a design workflow. It stands to reason that the elements that we use as families in Revit tend to come from a manufactured process previously, whether that's a door or a window or a piece of furniture, whatever it may be. So therefore, the tools that those other manufacturers use are of the likes of Inventor and so forth. So it makes sense for them to be able to take their manufacturing models and bring them into Revit. Now, that's not exactly what this particular slide is about. In this instance, rather than talking about the individual manufactured objects, this slide talks about a general workflow from taking a Revit building into Inventor so that an Inventor user can do something like a plant layout, maybe positioning all of their manufacturing items, it could be conveyor belts and so forth, in Revit, and then bringing that back into Revit. So again, it's a round trip process whereby the Revit model is linked into Inventor, and Inventor can now export out what they call a simplified version of a Revit file, that is an RVT file, that can then be linked back into our Revit project. While still on the interoperability, not too sure if you ever noticed, but in version 2021, they did introduce what they call shared views, or 2D, just shared views. This was found on the Collaborate tab, and it's this shared views button that we can see in this screenshot up here. In the past version, we could only share a 3D view. Now, you might also be wondering, well, in what way are we sharing it? So Autodesk has their own browser-based sharing technology that they call the Autodesk Viewer. I think it's at viewer.autodesk.com from memory. That now is integrated a little bit more directly into their design tools. So in Revit 2021's case, we could open up a 3D view, share that up to the Autodesk Viewer, and then grab the share link and then maybe email that to a recipient. The recipient with their web browser can open up this shared information, which was formerly a 3D view, and they could do some markups on it and view it and so forth. In 2022, that sharing capability is now opened up to 2D views and sheets. So this way you can actually share a drawing, if you like, with an external party. They can then do their marking up and comments, and we can see over in this right-hand screenshot that once they've made that feedback, we can then use the shared views window to view and find out what their feedback is, so that then we can obviously action that in our design model. You might also be asking, well, how does this differ to the likes of Autodesk's BIM 360 and their newer Construction Cloud? Put simply, this is a one-off share that is time limited. So typically it lasts for 30 days unless it's manually extended. After that 30-day period, all the information is removed. As opposed to BIM 360 and Construction Cloud, that is a permanent project space where people can serve themselves with the information and do markups on their own without having the information necessarily shared with them prior to their review process. And talking of those cloud platforms, the BIM 360 or Autodesk Construction Cloud, in past versions, when working with either standalone or work shared Revit models, the workflow for saving and opening those files kind of differed a little bit. They weren't exactly the most consistent processes. In Revit 2022, this is now unified to use common features regardless of whether we've got a work shared model or a standalone model. Moving over into the documentation side, starting with the scheduling of worksets. This is personally something that I've not really even thought about in the past, but it must have been a requirement for a number of people for it to be added. In this instance here, the workset names can be used as a parameter in schedules. So whether that is either for possibly filtering what is shown in a schedule by way of its workset, or maybe even showing it as a parameter, as a column in the finished schedule itself. So we can do this in most schedules, most notably the element schedules, but it's also relevant for materials views and sheets. Whilst still talking about schedule enhancements, they've now included shared parameters in key schedules. Now, key schedules is one of those more limited and almost rarely used types of schedules. Without actually having the ability to show you a live example here at the moment, if you don't know what a key schedule is, think of it as a schedule that's then placed into another schedule. If we look at doors as an example, we can do a door schedule and we can schedule out the heights, the widths, the colors and materials and so forth. But doors might have maybe a hardware package that's attached to it. And those hardware packages can come in a variety of different combinations. A key schedule is essentially one of those packages that define what kind of hardware can be attached to it, and that acts as a key reference inside that door schedule. So as I said, they kind of got a little bit more of a limited use. However, shared parameters can now be used in key schedules, which might very well actually open up the ability to use key schedules in other, maybe more interesting ways. Time will tell. We have the ability to filter a schedule by family and type. I'm so glad to see this, as I've needed this or wanted this many times in the past myself when working on projects. So quite simply, just up here on the filtering, we can now use the family and type as a field. And probably the biggest one on this slide here is the ability to now split schedules across sheets. I know there are going to be plenty of people who will use and have needed this in the past. So we know that we can split schedules, all right? But when we split the schedules in past versions, the split had to occur on the same sheet. Now, when you split a schedule, it'll then ask you which sheet would you like to put it on, whether it's the same sheet or maybe moving it over onto a different sheet altogether. This is going to be quite useful for when you've got a massive schedule that just simply cannot fit onto a single sheet. A really tiny improvement to the reporting or the, let's say the exporting of a schedule. Formerly, it could only go out to a TXT file, which we could open up in the likes of, say, Excel and convert it into more of a spreadsheet. Now we can also export out to a CSV file. That's a comma separated value file, and it is just simply a new type of file that you'll find in the export dialog box. In the past, when we've selected multiple elements that may contain different parameter values, the properties palette in particular just generally blanked out and didn't show you what that information was. And that stands to reason, because you can't necessarily show multiple parameter values where they differ. So now what they've included is what they call the varies indicator. And we can now see inside the properties palette where multiple elements may be selected, rather than just completely removing that parameter, it's going to say that the value actually varies. And we also find this inside of schedules. Now, the word varies can also be customized. So over inside your settings, you will have the ability to override what it says. It does default to a lowercase indicator. However, you may like to override that to be uppercase, or maybe put your own custom text in there to say something other than just varies. What's interesting is on this same slide here, we can also see that there's a tag that's tagging multiple wall objects that are obviously in this instance all different. And the tag is also noting that the information varies. And that leads on to the next improvement, which is around tags. Tags can now also have multiple leader lines. That is to say that maybe back in this previous example where we do have multiple walls, that if they were all of the same type, instead of having 3 individual tags, we can now have one tag that has multiple leader lines coming out to those other instances. Similar to this shower receptors example over here on the right-hand side. Other improvements for tagging includes rotated tags. So here's a good example whereby this particular unit or room isn't quite square on the page. Maybe the rest of the building is, but this sort of deviates a little bit over here in the top left-hand corner. Well, now there is an angle parameter so that they can override the angle, keeping it a little bit more parallel and perpendicular with its perimeter walls. And tags can also now tag curtain wall mullions. Multi-category tags have also received improvement, and they can now tag more categories of elements. My understanding is that that pretty much means that all elements are now taggable with multi-categories. I haven't yet come across a particular category that it can't. Now, this one is sure to, I'm hoping, excite many people who work on larger projects that require Revit links. Historically, tagging linked elements has just been a pain. Things like tags tend to become unhosted if the link were to disappear, and there's a lot of work to make corrections. We can finally rehost tags for linked elements. So this means if the linked element were to disappear, maybe it was unloaded and then it was reloaded at a later stage, the tag would remember the element ID of the linked element and therefore maintain or rehost the tag on that element that is now returned back into visibility within the view. Dimensions, another small improvement here. Previously, when we wanted to add a prefix or a suffix to a dimension, it could only be placed at the instance level. That meant if you had maybe 50 dimensions that all needed prefixes or suffixes, it was a bit of work to add those in for each instance. We can now finally put a prefix and a suffix in the type properties of the dimension. Obviously, this is going to be a little bit more of a limited use case, but there are obviously times when this needs to occur. So this should speed that process up quite a bit. Another good solid enhancement is actually in the revisions. Now, in the past, there's been difficulty, I guess you could say, with creating a more customized sequence of revisions, particularly if you wanted to move from one stage of the project into another stage. That is to say that you might be working in a sketch stage and your revision might want to say something like S1 for sketch revision 1. But then if that view or that sheet then transitions into a design development or maybe a construction stage, you might have the convention or past convention whereby you want your revisions to then say D1 for design development, or maybe C1 for construction, and so on. The revision numbering has now been improved so that you can customize this with your own additional sequences. And this is probably more so that it can also meet the newer ISO 19650 requirements, but there are going to be plenty of other cases whereby you may have wanted this when you first moved into Revit. I'm going to have another look at this after the PowerPoint. Okay, so still talking about things like dimensions and tags, but dimensions in this case here. Another historical issue that has finally been resolved is the ability to put spot slopes and spot elevations on ramps. Now, don't get me wrong, there's hacks and tricks whereby we could actually trick Revit into doing this in past versions. It wasn't perfect, issues arise. But in this case, we can now natively do this. This is one of those hooray about time features that have finally made it into Revit. Another one that I wish I had when I was working on high-rise residential design work is the ability to only show the core of a wall, so that this way we can now more easily do wall set out plans without having to worry about the finished layers sitting on the wall within our view. I'll show you this a little bit later on as well, but quite simply, this is now a new visibility graphic override option where we can now turn the non-core layers off. Grids are now visible in 3D views. In past versions, levels were, and now grids are as well. Quite simply, we just turn them on inside the visibility graphic overrides. We can then either select or hover over those grid lines to sort of highlight them and make them more apparent. But this just at least now gives us some extra context about grids and formally levels when working in a 3D view. What do we got here? We've got phase parameters that are now usable in view filters. Now, we know that phasing has its own phase graphic overrides inside the phase settings. This just adds some extra flexibility so that when you are creating a visibility graphic override filter, we can now include the phase as a filter rule. This is just so that we can go ahead and add, I guess, some extra graphical distinction into our models. And you can see that over here on the right-hand side, whereby things like the walls and the doors in this top image, it's not entirely clear, but adding in a filter to highlight both green and orange, depending on the phase that they've been added in, just does a better job of highlighting those within the views. And while we're on the topic of coloring our model and views, the default color fill in those color fill schemes has now been greatly improved. I'm sure anybody who has used the color fill scheme in the past has cringed at the bold, harsh, strong colors that they defaulted to. They've now been done away with, and they now put in a much lighter and pastel color as a starting point. Now, you don't necessarily have to like the colors that they choose, but it certainly looks a lot better than those harsher colors that they previously had. Coming back to filters again, so inside the visibility graphic overrides on the filter tab, they've added in the ability to do multi-selections. This might sound like a fairly small improvement. It is, but the benefits that we get out of it are actually a little bit bigger, in that when we can now multiple select the filters in this list, we can now move them as a group essentially up and down in the list, and we can also now override their properties in one go as well. And I think that's where the main advantage of being able to do this multi-selection now occurs, is in the overriding of multiple filters at a time. In past versions of Revit, if we had a call out on a section, an elevation, a plan view, and that parent view was deleted, so too was the call out. Quite simply now, you have the option when the parent view is deleted, or if it's deleted out of the project, you will now be given the choice whether you want to additionally delete the child call out, or whether you want to make it an independent view. For example, if you've got a floor plan with a call out on it and the floor plan parent was deleted, it'll then give you the option to turn the call out into what is essentially a cropped plan view. This is another one of those hooray about time improvements, one that I wish I had many, many years ago, and that is the ability to maintain the annotation orientation within families. I have no doubt that you've probably all experienced putting in something like a light or some other kind of electrical fixture in a project. Let's focus on a light as an example. So in this example here, we might be looking at a sconce light, and it's attached to a flat ceiling. When we do that, the symbol, the annotation within that light will show, because it's actually sitting on a flat ceiling. But as soon as you put a slope into the ceiling or try to place it on a wall, in past versions, that annotation symbol could not be maintained and it would be removed from your plan view. In 2022, this is resolved, and therefore, irrespective of the surface and the angle of that surface that we're placing it on, the annotation symbol is maintained. Okay, we're going to go through just a couple of those features. I always like to do a little bit of a live demonstration on something with my presentations. So let's go ahead and jump over to Revit 2022. I'm going to start with the path of travel. Now, in past versions, on the Analyze tab, we can see that we have a route analysis tool. And in past versions, it is pretty much just the ability to put a single path of travel in. Now, this plan view that I've got here already has a single path of travel. We can see that we've got the starting point over here on the right-hand side and specifying the endpoint, and it'll find the most optimized route through the building or even around the building to get to point B. In 2022, let me just delete this one out here. We can now put in a multiple paths option. Again, from the starting point through to the end, and in this instance, putting in what we call a minimum path separation. That is to say, between those 2 points, find routing options that maintain a minimum spacing of 2 meters. We can obviously override that, but I'm going to go from point A to point B. Okay, like so. And we can see there, it's given us 2 paths that are separated by 2 meters. One of those paths is, as we had previously, But the other path we can see here, let me zoom out a little bit, has actually gone all the way out the front door and all the way around the back and come in this other door to that point. Now, you might be looking at this and wondering, well, why didn't it come out the front door and then take this shorter path across the front of the building and in through this side door? And this comes down to that minimum 2 meter separation that I requested when I put this in previously. It means that this door is less than 2 meters away from this path. So therefore, this particular door was not considered an option, and therefore it had to find another path, which happened to be around the back of the building. Let me undo that. Let me put that first path back in again. The additional features in 2022 also include a one-way indicator. And we can see here that I've already got an indicator. It's not a door, it's just like an indicator that says across this threshold here, only allow the direction in one way. And obviously going from point A on the right over to the left is going to pass through that particular one-way indicator. If we actually flip that around the other direction now and selecting the routing and updating it up on the ribbon here, you can see there it can't use that one-way indicator as its passage, and therefore it's now taking the rear door and coming in at the top and back to that end point. Now, obviously, in our COVID environment these days, we know that things like places like supermarkets and shopping centers, they typically have a one-way in, one-way out. As an example, this is where this particular feature may actually be of some use. But in addition to that is also the new people content option, which allows us to put in a person that has their own distancing zone around them. And we can see here with them placed in this corridor, obviously the path is not going to go around these internal offices here. However, if we now move this person over to this side and we now select the path and we update it, we can see here that the path is now going to take the other route around those internal offices. Now, this could be useful also for things like seating areas and other places where there might be a slightly higher occupancy rate where social distancing needs to be maintained. For example, this is like a GP's clinic, this particular building. We may have some chairs out here at the reception site. So if I just go ahead and we'll just pop that one in there, you know, there might be another chair over here. You might even have, let's see, there might be a chair up here against this wall. Okay, putting those in and again doing an update, we can see that it does try to route itself around those people. Obviously, the higher the density of the people, the harder it is for the routing to get through. Looking now over on the core walls feature, here I have a floor plan that has pretty much just walls turned on. I'll just turn my line weights off, and we can see here these walls have the additional finishes on either side of them. However, if we go into the visibility graphic overrides, down to the walls category, there it is, and we can see that we have a new subcategory called non-core layers. We can simply untick this and those finishes are now turned off, leaving just the core of the wall. And that will certainly make our setup plans a lot cleaner and a lot more, let's say, reliable when it comes to placing our core dimensions. Moving over to the revisions and sheets, up on the View tab on the Sheet Composition panel inside the Revisions dialog box. Okay, we know in past versions that we've typically had the ability to set the numbering to be none, alphanumeric, or numeric. And their numbering settings were controlled inside this button down here in the bottom right-hand corner. This now has an additional dialog box so that we can create additional numbering sequences. So coming back to the example that I mentioned in the previous PDF, if I generate a new sequence, I might call this something like sketch. I might give this a prefix of S. There's a couple of additional new fields in here as well. So we can now set the minimum number of digits. So we might want 01 to be shown rather than just 1, and also the starting number that we want to start with our numeric numbering. If I go ahead and add in another one, let's call it, we'll just call this design, as in like design development. And if we did something a little bit different here. Let me close this. And I should have actually opened up a sheet before I went into that dialog box. So let me go to my ground floor plan sheet. Okay, I've come over to the revision schedule over here on the right. Okay, let me jump back into that same revisions dialog box where, remembering, I've now just generated the sketch and the design. This one here is the owner request revision that was number 03, which is this one up here. So therefore, if I was to do an override on this and change it to the sketch numbering format, we can see there that in the schedule, it now says S1, or if we're in a later design stage and we're now wanting to change the revisioning numbering, we can go ahead and change the numbering again so that we've now got the D1 convention. So that should certainly open up the flexibility of the revisions for some people that want that extra level of granularity. Now, extending on the revisions and just finishing off the session with the exporting of the PDFs, up underneath the File tab, down under Export, and now selecting PDF, okay, we can utilize familiar features from our typical printing process of past versions of Revit. Here we can see that we've got the ability to print sheet sets or sets of views and sheets. Down the bottom here, you've got some of those common print settings that we would typically use, noting, and I mentioned it before, that we've got automatic orientation and sheet selection. But the crux of this actually falls in the middle here, and that is the ability to set up a PDF export set. I've used the ISO definition here. And when I want to print out to individual PDF files, similar to what I've got over here inside of Windows Explorer, something like this particular format, we can use the new naming rules to set up, almost like setting up the fields inside a tag. We can say which information we would like to use, which in this case is a combination of project information and sheet information, pulling it all together with some separators, and then using the export button to export each of these sheets out to their own individually and uniquely named PDF files. That's certainly going to improve that PDF exporting process for a number of people. Oops. Okay, so like I said, we've got 2 more of these Revit 2022 what's new coming in the future. We've got one for structures and one for MEP. So if you happen to be interested in those, you can go to our events page to find out the details, not to mention any other events that we may be running into the future. If you've got any questions about Revit 2022, maybe you're not even on Revit to begin with, we can certainly help you with a transition process from your existing tools. Or if you just want to talk to us about any other design-related technologies, feel free to reach out to us at info@a2ktechnologies.com.au. But with that, I am going to close out the session. We are almost on time. So thank you very much for your attendance today. I hope that was of some significant value. Like I said, this was actually quite a large release, so there's quite a lot there to take in. But otherwise, have a great day.